Vito Genovese, allegedly one of the most powerful underworld figures in the country.
Today, New York's criminal underworld is co-operated by the infamous 5 families of the American Mafia, with ties to many foreign crime syndicates and with hands in many a political pie. They act as the nexus point for black markets and interests alike. But one of these families has played a larger hand than others in fostering this intricate collaboration after years of infighting. Through bloodshed, betrayal, and backroom deals, they pushed the old mafia out of an era of discord into the organized coalition it is today. Who spearheaded this transition? Who was responsible for the formation of the Genovese crime family? Like most things in America, organized crime migrated from abroad, tentacles attached to both Sicily's La Cosa Nostra and Italy's Camorra crime syndicates in the 1860s, looking for new opportunities in, well, the land of opportunity. And just like these organizations, the first subject of today's tale braved the stormy seas of the Atlantic to make a new life for himself in 1906. Salvatore Luciania was only 9 years old when his family immigrated from Sicily, with his parents and 3 younger siblings settling in East Harlem, New York. Only 4 years later, drawn by the influence of the street, he would drop out of school and join Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli's 5 Points gang, smuggling opium for a living. It was here he brushed shoulders with a young, inexperienced Al Capone, and the boys helped Vaccarelli operate his many businesses, including protection and prostitution. Young Luciania, operating under the name Charles Luciano, thrived within both rackets and made a name for himself protecting Jewish immigrants from the bigoted eyes of the mob, who at the time worked only with those of Italian or Sicilian descent. After 5 years, however, he found himself behind bars for a year, charged with possession of heroin. His family refused to visit him in prison, and after his release, he was booted from his family home, disowned for taking up with such activities. Following an attempt on Vaccarelli's life, the leader kept a low profile, and his second-in-command, Johnny Torrio, left Harlem to find new opportunities in Chicago. Luciano and Capone both held their own as allegiances began to crumble, enforcing their own rackets without any necessary supervision. Though in the onset of 1919, sweeping changes to the status quo were about to be amended into the U.S. Constitution, and they would need to adapt or be lost in the past forever. The passage of Prohibition changed the landscape of the criminal world, and the political as well. The citizenry found it hard to cope with the loss of a once widely accepted pastime, and it was easy for the criminal underworld to pay government officials to look the other way when they started up their bootlegging operations. Many of these officials were thirsty customers after all. Even once legitimate businessmen saw this lucrative new black market for what it was. One of these men was Arnold Rothstein, an investment banker and gambler who was recently implicated in the fix of the 1919 World Series. 5 Points was leaderless by this time. Many of its members spread to the wind. Al Capone was relocated to Chicago after Prohibition was ratified in 1919, invited there by Johnny Torrio to oversee his growing bootlegging racket. Luciano stuck to what he knew best, however, and oversaw all of the protection and prostitution operations in East Harlem. That is, until Rothstein came knocking on his doorstep. He saw Luciano's business savvy and potential, and he was more than willing to take a gamble on the man who defended the Jews of Harlem. But Rothstein wasn't the only person who took notice of Luciano's skill set. When the infrastructure of 5 Points was lost, various criminal families connected to La Cosa Nostra and the Camorra took to claiming racket after racket, and Luciano's success only painted a target on his back when this started to happen. In 1920, the Morello family approached Luciano with an offer he could not refuse. This, however, was different from the usual grifts seen by the other remnants of 5 Points. No, not the usual power grab at all. The Morello family had a problem. they were still recovering from a brutal defection from the Camorra that left many of its heads either dead or imprisoned. What's more, after the recent release of its founder and many of his lieutenants, a Camorra loyal family in New York, the D'Aquilas, vied to end them for good. Their founder, Giuseppe Morello, was forced to flee to Sicily while his half-brother Vincenzo Terranova maintained operational control. Giuseppe Joe Massaria, Morello's enforcer, stayed in New York to combat the threat, but he knew he needed help and street smarts. His offer to Luciano: help him combat the threat and maintain control of his operations. An easy decision. 1920 was more than kind to the man. He was not only bootlegging, but enforcing for one of the first true American Mafia families. What's more, he was making new connections that would last a lifetime. At least, as long as this life would allow him. Luciano met two men within the ranks of the Morello family and became fast friends with them. Their names were Frank Costello and Vito Genovese, both Italian-born mafiosi who held a great respect for his abilities. Frank, a shrewd pacifist, appreciated Luciano's level head and attention to detail. Genovese, a heavy-handed, deliberate man, respected Luciano's quick wit and brutal efficiency. Together, with funding from Rothstein, they started their own bootlegging operation, while also combating the Tequila family with Massaria. Despite their best efforts, however, on May 8, 1922, Vincenzo Terranova was murdered by the Tequila's enforcer, Umberto Valenti, in a drive-by shooting outside his home. Following this, Massaria stepped in as boss of the Morellos, and he organized search after search for the man responsible. After months of failed hits on both sides, including an attempt on Massaria not 2 days previous, which saw 2 bullets pass through the very hat he wore, on August 11th, Luciano personally dealt the killing blow to the rival family's head assassin, effectively ending the power struggle. Luciano thrived in the following years under the umbrella of the Morellos, and his new friends Costello and Genovese became an integral part of every business venture he undertook. Their shared efforts saw to the immense success of their bootlegging racket, so much that in fact in 1929, Luciano drew the attention of a long-lost connection, and their reunion would forever change the face of modern crime in America. Johnny Torrio heard of his old subordinate's success in New York and invited him to meet in Chicago to discuss business. Luciano had other plans though, larger plans, and asked Torrio to assemble all of his contacts, requesting a meeting of minds in Atlantic City. On May 13, 1929, business associates of Capone, Torrio, Luciano, Costello, and more congregated to discuss the future of their businesses, the future of their cooperation. 2 people who weren't invited, however, Giuseppe Massaria and his current rival, Salvatore Maranzano. There was no room for conflict in this conference. The man who graciously hosted the conference, Enoch Nucky Johnson, he was a political powerhouse in Atlantic City, sheriff of Atlantic County, and oversaw every illicit operation under his jurisdiction. He made hotel accommodations, found entertainment, food, women, anything any boss needed. He truly rolled out the red carpet for the criminal underworld, and that carpet would stay open over a course of 3 days. Mob bosses were pictured by paparazzi on the Atlantic City boardwalk, casually strolling sandy beaches and wetting their feet in the sea. Under Johnson's supervision, these men were absolutely untouchable. Discussions centered around one thing: the creation of a national multi-ethnic crime syndicate that oversaw the production and distribution of every bootlegging operation in the United States. Luciano's intentions were clear. He was done with the petty division based on an outmoded way of thought. He didn't see a world based on blood right. He saw exactly what his old mentor Rothstein taught him to see. He saw business, plain and simple, and he was willing to work with anyone worth their salt. He invited not only members of the Italian-American mob, but also members of the Jewish mob and the Irish mob to join his new syndicate. The conference was an overwhelming success, and everyone began to understand what made Luciano stand out. He was intelligent, he had common sense, he was fair. That was something the bosses of old were missing. And now that Luciano was turning heads by giving others this respect, these old bosses only started to see a threat to their rule of law. On October 17, 1929, Luciano, while on a trip to Staten Island, was abducted by 4 men and brought to a warehouse before he was beaten brutally and his throat slashed. They soon left him, thinking he was dead, but Luciano was far from it. In the early morning hours of October 18th, the bloodied and bruised man stumbled into a hotel lobby and was quickly taken to the hospital. He recovered in time, but was left permanently disfigured by the attack, now sporting a droopy right eye and a deep scar across his neck and chin. Costello and Genovese came up with a new name for their friend following this incident: Lucky Luciano. While the true culprits of the attack were never revealed, Luciano had his suspicions as to who ordered it. Someone excluded from his coalition, someone who may have felt betrayed due to this. Collaborating with Genovese, who also thought Masseria was responsible, the two men decided they needed to prove their methods were effective. They were going to rule Morello now. In order to do that, though, they needed to make sure that nobody was going to challenge their right to the throne. On August 15, 1930, Luciano secretly ordered the murder of Giuseppe Morello, the original founder of the family, while he was collecting debts for Masseria. After getting rid of this prominent figurehead, Luciano met with Masseria's rival, Maranzano, and the two collaborated on a scheme to end the bloodshed for good. On April 15, 1931, they finally set this plan in motion and lured Masseria to Coney Island, to an exclusive mob restaurant where Luciano and him played cards. After a bit of time, Luciano excused himself to the bathroom, while Genovese and another mob enforcer walked in through the front door. They riddled Masseria with bullets before collecting Luciano from the bathroom and driving away from the establishment. Since there were no credible witnesses, this murder never went to trial. Maranzano was grateful to Luciano for stopping the year-long feud between himself and Masseria. So grateful, in fact, that he made Luciano the new head of the Morello family. But despite his new prominence, he did not forget about his closest friends. No, he made Genovese his right hand, his underboss. And Costello, he appointed him to be his advisor, his consigliere. Maranzano respected the organized structure that Luciano had created in his national crime syndicate and believed that this was the only way New York's gangs would survive in the future. He called a meeting of every family under this umbrella and organized his own structure, enacted his own will. He demanded cooperation. He demanded fealty. Maranzano assembled what today is the 5 families of the American Mafia. Maranzano came from the Old World and had direct ties to the Camorra in Italy. He often drew parallels between himself and Caesar, viewing these 5 families, which he also called La Cosa Nostra, as his own empire. He even declared himself Capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. Obviously, this didn't sit well with the other families, but the final straw came when Maranzano started taking rackets from his compatriots. His reign did not last long, and on September 10, 1931, Luciano and Genovese arranged for the assassination of this self-appointed emperor. Using their connections with the Jewish Mafia, they sent 4 men, disguised as government agents, to Maranzano's office where they disarmed his bodyguards and stabbed him repeatedly before executing him with a gunshot. A few days later, the bodies of 2 of his closest allies were found in Newark Bay. Rather than take the throne for himself, Luciano abolished the name Capo di tutti capi, feeling it caused too many problems, and worked together with the 5 families to establish a new network, an organization that they called the Commission. Luciano led this commission under the title First Among Equals, and now having 2 criminal networks under his supervision, expanded his black business well beyond anything that had ever been seen before. Luciano reigned supreme for nearly 5 years before one of his ill deeds came back to bite him. Not murder, not drug smuggling, not political intervention, but something he had been doing since he was a teenager with the 5 Points Gang. On June 7, 1936, Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years for pandering, otherwise known as pimping. His prostitution rackets had continued to grow over the years into an international network that oversaw nearly all of the brothels in the United States. Another of his well-organized and thought-out pursuits. While in prison, Luciano still ran the mob, but Genovese now acted as the face of the leadership. He would often visit Luciano in prison to receive his orders, but this lasted very shortly because he himself had his own legal troubles to worry about. In 1937, Genovese fled the United States to Italy to escape a murder charge, but in order to stay, due to the onset of World War II, he needed to pledge himself to Benito Mussolini and his fascist party. When this happened, Luciano appointed Costello as the new boss of the Luciano family. Luciano had another visitor in 1942, however, the U.S. Navy. They were willing to offer him a deal to lighten his sentence if he offered them his assistance. Prior to the Allied invasion of Italy in 1943, Luciano gave the government volumes of information about operations overseas, and when they finally did invade, Genovese even offered his own assistance. Though his help wasn't entirely benevolent, while acting as an interpreter and informant for the army, he was caught stealing supplies, rations, weapons, vehicles even, and selling them on the black market for his own profit. His help was too important to the wartime effort, however, and no charges were ever brought against him. Following the Allied victory in 1945, Genovese returned to the United States, but he wasn't exactly welcomed back with open arms. Costello brought him back into the family, but he did not give him the power that he once had. The five families had grown weary of him due to his excessive violence and ability to freely jump between allegiances. No matter what he had done to help Luciano rise to power, his unpredictable nature was now seen as a threat to everyone. In 1946, Luciano was released from prison, on the condition that he'd be deported back to Italy. He accepted these terms, but as soon as he arrived in Naples, he boarded another flight, a flight headed almost exactly back to the United States. He wasn't ready to walk away from everything he had built. Not just yet. On October 29, 1946, after a month of plane hopping and ship sailing throughout various cities surrounding the U.S., Luciano arrived in Havana, Cuba, and set up permanent residence. He corresponded with Costello, who was growing more afraid of Genovese by the day, and Luciano promised not to leave his longtime friend exposed to any sort of retaliation. On December 20th, 1946, Luciano ordered the five families to Havana so they could discuss business. The first order of business dealing with the looming threat of Genovese. Luciano proposed to everyone his revitalization of the title Capo di tutti capi, and he received an overwhelming amount of support. Each family supported the idea because they understood that he would respect them, that he would work with them, that he would protect them. Genovese was flabbergasted by this development, and in a fury, he disclosed Luciano's current residence to the U.S. government. In response to this development, the U.S. government pressured Cuba to deport Luciano back to Italy, threatening to halt all imports of prescription narcotics, Cuba's largest export at the time. By February of the next year, Luciano was back in Italy, and while he was never put behind bars again, for the rest of his life, he'd have to routinely report to police every Sunday, was subject to a curfew every night, and he was not allowed to leave Italy under any circumstances. Frank Costello held the title of boss for 10 years and was just as patient, just as respectful as Luciano. He ensured that Luciano's legacy was honored and made wise decisions to ensure the growth of the five families. But on May 2, 1957, he was ambushed in the lobby of his apartment building and shot in the head. Though he miraculously survived the attack, which was orchestrated by Genovese. With the blows literally hitting close to home, Costello knew he was out of his depth. He relinquished control to Genovese and walked away from his life of crime, becoming a government informant. Vito Genovese took control of everything Luciano had built and staked his claim in true mob fashion. What was once a branch of the Camorra, the Morello family, and then the Luciano family, was now reappropriated as the Genovese family. With his new power, he assassinated all of those with an allegiance to Luciano and called a meeting in Appalachian, New York, to officiate his new status. But Luciano had one more trick up his sleeve. The meeting of over 100 mob bosses was raided by the federal police, and Genovese was apprehended on drug charges. During court proceedings, a Puerto Rican drug dealer that Luciano had paid $100,000 to implicated Genovese in an international drug smuggling operation, and on April 17, 1959, Genovese was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Luciano lived long enough to see his final revenge come into fruition, and after his death on January 26, 1962, his body was returned to the U.S., where he was buried alongside his family in Queens. Genovese maintained operational control behind bars, however, and for 10 years he puppeteered the 5 families under a brutal new facade. He died of a heart attack on February 14, 1969, and passed on the legacy of Luciano to one of his lieutenants. Today, the Genovese mob still runs much in the same way that Luciano had operated it, and while it no longer bears his name, it will forever be indebted to him for bestowing them with such a focused, clockwork operation. Thank you for joining me here at The Curious Clam. I hope you enjoyed this video. I put a lot of work into researching these stories and hope you learned something new while you were here. If you want to help me grow so I can keep bringing you more videos just like this, please leave a like and subscribe so you stay up to date on every release. See you around!